ever since I've been in the content marketing world, I've heard from executives, bosses, they love this phrase. They're like, well, we just need to put some thought leadership out on it. Define that. What do you mean? What do you want to put out? What is that?
What does it really mean to be a thought leader in B2B? That's what we're here to find out. This is The Notorious Thought Leader, a podcast for B2B marketers who want to generate demand by creating content that builds credibility and thought leadership. In each episode, Erin Balsa helps demystify thought leadership and uncovers how companies are using thought leadership to generate demand. Let's get started.
My guest today is Tracey Wallace, who's the Director of Content Strategy at Klaviyo. Thanks for being here today, Tracey.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Me too. So I've known you for a while now, and I am honestly pumped to have you on the show because A, you know your shit. And for anyone who's listening that doesn't currently subscribe to Tracey's newsletter, Contentment, I highly recommend it, especially for any content marketers who aspire to become content leaders. It's really helpful, and I read it religiously. And B, you have an interesting view on thought leadership content, and I would love to kind of double click on that. But first, in your own words, what does it mean to be a thought leader?
Oh, goodness. In my own words, what does it mean to be a thought leader? I mean, clearly individuals can be thought leaders. And honestly, that's probably a little bit easier than brands being thought leaders. So from an individual point of view, it's, folks who are considered to be experts on a given topic, right? Whatever that topic might be, they talk about it a lot. They educate folks on it. Sometimes they're the first people bringing up specific topics, related to those things. We see a bunch of creators or the rise of creators that's happened over the last few years. A lot of those folks are thought leaders. Creators kind of just a new word for thought leader, though I guess they're also monetizing, and thought leaders, some of them used to monetize by writing books and stuff, right? And we see a different way of monetizing now with creators. Companies, of course, can also be thought leaders on a variety of, or not on a variety. Again, ideally, this is on a specific topic. I do think it is harder and takes more time for companies to become thought leaders. And a lot of that is just because all of us as humans like and trust other humans more and better than we like and trust companies, right? And so it takes us a little bit longer to build that trust and with an organization or with a brand. This is, we see this happen a lot in media. Now, media organizations, for the most part, I guess you could classify them as thought leaders, but they often aren't covering just one thing. They're the ones who are definitely could be considered thought leaders in that thing. But you take the New York Times, for example, or any media publication, reader trust is so incredibly important to what they do. And they can lose it really fast. We have seen a lot of media organizations lose trust across the board over the last 5, 10, 20 years, right? And so that trust takes a really, really long time to build from an organizational point of view, and it's a really slippery slope. You can lose it real fast. So I guess there's kind of two different ways to look at it. So there's thought leaders as people, thought leaders as companies. Both of it really centered around you being an expert, sharing advice, insights, expertise around a given topic.
So, I'm hearing the word trust, which is a really key element for me. And also, building that or sharing that expertise. But at the same time, we had talked prior to recording about, do you have to be a true subject matter expert to be seen as a thought leader? So could you talk about that?
Yeah. And no, I don't think you do. And that kind of sucks, right? That's where, I don't know, it's a weird world that we live in which, the internet is a place full of a lot of information. It's free for most people to go and search and pull stuff out. I do think there's a lot of people who are growing large audience, and not a lot. I would actually imagine it's not the majority of people, but I do think there are people out there who are growing large audiences who aren't experts necessarily in the thing that they're talking about. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not going to become experts over time, but a lot of folks, and we've even seen this historically as well. Sometimes when you are someone who is far better at talking to people, doing promotional stuff, writing books historically, but not so good in terms of being a practitioner at those things, you can still become a thought leader in that thing without ever having actually done that thing. That's not something I personally love. I'm very much somebody who believes that it's really important to get in the arena and do the work, because you get a lot of really valuable insights based on doing that, right? Like my newsletter Contentment, yes, is for content marketing leaders primarily, but it's also really centered around how do you grow a content marketing organization without burning yourself or your team out. And it comes from me being in the arena, really failing to do that last part, right? I made a really successful organization, but failed on that personal front or that leadership front in terms of making sure my team and myself weren't not doing well, or were whatever, however those words go together to mean doing okay. And so, and again, I feel like that's something that you really learn being in the arena. So yes, I think definitely there can be people who are considered thought leaders who aren't necessarily experts, but also that's always been the case. I don't think that's new by any means. I don't think that's a creator thing, or even necessarily, I guess I know I started with this where I said it was an internet thing because information is free, but a lot of this comes down to personal skills. A lot of people who are experts, I rely on actually two of the absolute best people I know in SEO are hardly on the internet. Both of them have incredibly successful agencies. Their agencies don't really have a presence on the internet. You find them mostly through referral and recommendation. They are phenomenal at this work, but they don't like doing that thought leadership kind of work, right? And that's okay.
Totally.
That's just personal preference.
Totally. And I was talking to an SEO expert with a really successful agency on the last episode of this podcast. And something he said that's really relevant to what you just said is that thought leadership and credibility is in the eye of the beholder, which I found really true. And that really resonated with me. For me, when I started this exploration of talking to people and trying to really understand thought leadership at a deeper level, I thought credibility was absolutely essential. And in my eyes, being credible means you are that subject matter expert. But that's just me. That's my perception, because other people might see that creator who has a course, even though they've been doing this thing for 6 months, and they might hear them. Repetition builds that trust too, even if the person is not necessarily sharing expert advice. So it really is in the eye of the beholder. It's really interesting.
Exactly. So same thing with me, right? Credibility matters a lot to me, and knowing where people have worked and the work that they've done before is really important to me in terms of how much of a thought leader I think they are. But you're absolutely right. That's me. I am one segment of an audience out there. There are a lot of other types of people who don't think that stuff is as important. And that's totally fine and okay too. This is just where, if someone, and it's an individual or even an organization wants to figure out how to become a thought leader, part of this is defining to whom.
Right. Exactly.
To whom and what do they think is a thought leader?
And what's your goal? Is your goal to sell an inexpensive course to the masses? It's pretty easy to build that kind of thought leader presence on Twitter or TikTok. But if your goal is to sell, a really expensive enterprise software, and you have to connect with these really brilliant people who are leading these Fortune 500 companies, you really do have to have a completely different profile.
Yeah. Or if you're targeting the developers instead of the marketers, right?
Yes.
I mean, all of that stuff really matters.
100%. Yeah. I had Ashley Foss from Atlassian on the first episode, and she, of course, is speaking to that audience, right?
Yeah.
It's not as easy as speaking to an audience of marketers, or, they really know their stuff, and you better too, or you're not going to be believed.
Yes. Oh man, developer. I love developers. A lot of my very good friends are developers. I've managed developers before. They are some of the like most honest, like no bullshit people out there. And I love that so much for them. It makes marketing to them ridiculously hard, especially for people who aren't developers themselves. And very few developers want to market because again, they don't like doing that stuff. So like there's a real niche out there. Talk about like if you want to find a niche to be a thought leader in, a marketer who focuses only on marketing to developers, you will be in crazy high demand
For sure.
around the tech world. And people will very much be interested in listening to what you have to say because it is hard even for really seasoned marketers to crack that egg.
Yeah, for sure. So I really wanted to talk about thought leadership content as a term because, you've probably noticed this too over the last, 5 or so years, more and more agencies and freelance writers are saying, I sell thought leadership content. I create thought leadership content. And there has been this bucketing of content types into SEO content versus thought leadership content.
Yeah.
And, I was on Tommy Walker's podcast, The Cutting Room. We were talking, I love Tommy too. We were talking about thought leadership a lot and thought leadership as a content kind of format. And he said, I had Tracey Wallace on the show and she said, thought leadership is not a format. It is the output. Or I'm not sure if I'm quoting you exactly. It's a goal. Yeah, I might be messing up your words there. But it's not a format. So could you kind of talk about that? I think it's something that's going to be new to some listeners who have only really thought about it as a content type. They're coming at it from a marketer or a writing perspective and not necessarily thinking about the historical context because, thought leadership has been around as a concept for a very long time. And my guest, Evan, actually said, it really dates back to Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. They were thought leaders. And people
where they literally sat around
and
thought all day.
Yes.
That is actually how that started. I love that. I don't think I've ever connected it all the way back to philosophy, but I am also a big philosophy person as well. Yes. So I have a newsletter on this. I talk about it on Twitter sometimes. And then of course chat about it with Tommy and Erin and, just the like world of content marketers that I find myself in a lot. I think thought leadership is a goal, not a content type. And this comes from a lot of different places. Similar kind of thing with SEO. SEO isn't a content type. It's a distribution channel. Like we're talking about it wrong. Those thoughts, and I'll talk about it specifically to thought leadership because we could probably have a whole other one on the SEO one, comes from my experience in this industry. So I started as a journalist in the fashion and beauty space. So working over at Elle Magazine and then Mashable for a while, covering what was then called the intersection of fashion and technology, which is just e-commerce today. So I started there and then moved over into the content marketing world. And ever since I've been in the content marketing world, I've heard from executives, bosses. I mean, like they love this phrase. They're like, well, we just need to put some thought leadership out on it. And the first thing that you do, again, I come from the journalism background and I'm like, okay, cool. Define that. What do you mean? What do you want to put out? What is that?
Yeah.
And nobody, seems to have a very good answer and everyone's answer is very different. Right? Which goes back to that thought leadership is different to everybody kind of thing. And so ultimately over the years, anytime somebody would say that to me, I'd be like, cool, we're going to ignore that. We're just going to put out some content on this topic that relates back to our product. And we're going to make it, the best content we possibly can on this. We're going to make sure we do research on it. Make sure all that research is decently recent. So trying not to find any research that's more than 2 years old, which is especially important now since COVID, because so much has changed since 2020. That numbers before 2020 kind of don't matter. So you wanna make sure that's there. Actually doing real interviews with folks. So making sure that either I'm interviewing or the folks that are writing for me are interviewing at least 3 different customers or partners or agencies or just experts in the space so we can get that kind of content into the piece. It also educates a writer because not all writers are experts in the thing they go to write on. nor should they necessarily be, right? So making sure that we're interviewing folks there, gathering a bunch of quotes from people, and then also making sure that we find examples. I have a pretty hard and fast rule that I started back when I was over at Big Commerce, which is if we can't find 3 examples of our customers doing a thing, then it's not a thing. Like we can't just like tell people to do this either because our organization wants people to, or because we think it's a good idea. Like we work in technology, right? Like we don't necessarily work in the space that our customers work in, which for me, because I've worked primarily in e-commerce tech, is, retailers. It's like, no, we need to show them that other people are doing this. Make sure it looks nice. Of course, we can't always tell if it's necessarily working, right? But always making sure that we have at least 3 examples. And whether this is right or wrong, I've been calling things that don't have that like fake news, because I'm like, well, you don't know. like you just don't know if that's real or not. To me, when you can set a really good content philosophy in terms of this is why we publish, for whom we publish, at the quality that we publish, and make sure that every piece of content that you put out has proper research put into it, great copy editing that goes into it, you're interviewing the proper amount of folks. UX even plays a role in this, because that can certainly affect like the overall look and feel, and look and feel helps build trust. When you do that consistently over time, that to me is what creates thought leadership from a brand perspective, which is your organization is seen as the type of company that puts out trustworthy, well-researched, well thought out, easy to follow content, that anytime you publish a piece of content on a topic that someone's interested in, they're going to go and read it, check it out, or share it with folks because you've built that trust over time. That to me is thought leadership. One piece of content will never do that for you. One campaign won't do that for you. You have to build it over time. Like, there's a great example. I mean, maybe not so much in terms of thought leadership from content, but I was just reading, again, I'm in the retail space. I was just reading about how Liquid Death is valued at this insane number right now. And y'all, they are selling canned water. That is it. It is just water. It's not even sparkling water. It's just water. It's plain water. And it's just in a really cool, well-branded can. And their website's cool and well-branded. And people are stoked to drink. They sell it at all the concerts now for $10 for water. It's just water, but it looks cool, right?
Yeah, it's Instagrammable, I bet, too, with that audience.
It's Instagrammable, exactly, right? And it makes kids and or people who don't drink, it looks like it could be a beer, and that feels cool and fun. And it's called Liquid Death, whatever. That's all branding. That is all branding. Everything about that is branding. And there's all these threads and these Slacks that I'm in where it's this might be one of the first brands in a while that has gotten to this value. Their product's great. It's good water, but it is water. Right? Product's great. But all of this hype is built on this really amazing brand, right? But they didn't build that brand overnight. They did the branding for it, all of that jazz, but then they had to get products in people's hands. They had to, make sure they're sharing all the stuff that people are sharing on Instagram, around the web. They had to build that. They had to nurture that. They had to get the trust to that level. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here. It's the same thing with your content, with your company, right? Content in general also is super fascinating because it sits in this interesting spot in an organization, which is it often serves almost always as a service organization, but then can also serve as a strategic organization. Very few other roles are both, and content kind of sits in the both. And the reason why it can be so strategic is because content can play across your funnel. Content can be a brand play because the ultimate goal of content is to get your organization that thought leadership. But content also sits in the middle of the funnel because you don't want just people coming and reading your stuff. You want them to convert, right? Mm-hmm. So got to get them into the funnel. And then, okay, once they're into the funnel, how are you reusing content to move leads into MQLs down to revenue? How are you working with your sales team to make sure they're reusing content to reach out to prospects? And then, of course, how are you using content either in your product or as part of a retention flow to make sure that that content can help keep the customers that you have, one, there, and two, excited. So again, content serves a really big strategy point, but content is, and well, not only, but can be a really big brand play. And that I think is ultimately what leaders mean, where they're like, let's get a thought leadership piece out around email marketing. And you're like, okay,
Right.
let's think about how to do that. And I mean, to me, I don't care if that's what leaders and folks want to call it. To me, thought leadership really is, it is the consistent publishing of high quality work, often then formatted in ways that make it look either more beautiful, more authoritative, whatever it might be. Like, if your folks are really looking for thought leadership content, then maybe that means you need to go talk to some of the biggest experts in the space or get your biggest customers in the space to contribute to content. But that then raises another question, which is, why aren't you doing that for all of your content? Like, if you have the means and resources, like this is another mantra I've used throughout my content marketing career, which is, I don't ever want to waste anyone's time. My teams write long form content for a lot of reasons. It does decently well in search, but also it makes it easy for us to then repurpose that content throughout the funnel in a variety of different formats. And I'm always looking to save time because we have lives to lead outside of content, believe it or not. So I don't want to waste people's time when they get to a piece. I want to make sure that we have everything that they need there, including hearing from the absolute best folks doing the things that we are recommending folks do. Again, that builds thought leadership over time. It makes it far easier when your exec comes and says, we want to do a thought leadership piece on email marketing. Great. That just might mean you need to repurpose or reformat some of the stuff that you already have, right?
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, all that to say, to me, thought leadership is a goal. It's a brand goal in particular that content can ultimately contribute to, but it is not a content type. Even, some people say that thought leadership content is like when the CEO writes a letter to the audience. It's like, oh, okay, that's a type of content for sure. But doing that once isn't going to get all that much for you, right? You still need to be thinking through the go to market for that piece. Sure, what is it that they're going to say? But if they only do it, are they doing it once a year, once a quarter? What are they talking about? What's the point? Content needs to have this consistency to it, again, to build that trust. And I come from a journalism background, and I think that's where a lot of that belief comes from.
God, you hit on so many notes, and I want to respond.
I talked for a long time. I'm so sorry.
I'm like, oh my God, I want to say 10 million things. But what I will start with is bucketing content. I have seen so many companies personally with my own eyes who do exactly what you're like, I don't want to waste people's time. And what they do is they invest their content team's resources into creating what they call thought leadership content. And it's fine if you want to call it that. Call it whatever you want to call it so that you know what you're talking about internally, externally. That's fine, right?
Sure.
But they have another, outsourced agency creating their SEO content. They're completely disjointed. The only reason they're doing it is to drive traffic to the site. I'm like, that is just such a huge mistake. So if you're listening and you're thinking about your SEO content and your thought leadership content as two complete different animals, and you're, trusting your internal team to create one but not the other, please rethink that, because that is not the way to win in today's very competitive landscape.
Yeah. I have so much to add there. So many people do that. And it is so mind blowing to me. It's also, I think, a poor selling tactic for a lot of those agencies that sell that. They have to know this doesn't work, right? They've been doing it for so many people. And anyways, neither here nor there. People who do that stuff, I tend to call that internet trash. You've all seen it. It's content that might be ranking well, but is awful when you land there. Not helpful, does waste people's time. It's not going to be on page one for long. That Google algorithm is changing almost every day now, the way these folks are. Google's getting a lot of pressure from other places. So that's why that's happening more often. But it's not going to stay there long. When you think about SEO and just the Google algorithm in general, one, as I mentioned, it's a distribution channel, not every blog that you publish needs to use SEO as a distribution channel. Now, I'd argue that all of them should try, right? Sometimes there's longer tail keywords that you could, of course, publish something on and try to get even lower traffic volume on. But, and most of the blogs I've run, we're actually going to start doing this over at Klaviyo too. We have pieces that are like, that have SEO as a core part of their distribution strategy. And then other pieces that we call like human interest stories that like aren't really going to get a lot of search traffic. Or if they do, it's not going to be on terms we care about because they're stories about our customers who are doing really cool things. And it's like a feature about them. Those pieces, though, typically get picked up by newsletters. They get shared far more often on social, right? Like those are our distribution channels for those pieces. Now, they're not incredibly evergreen pieces. They might, only necessarily be relevant for a year or so. That's totally fine. I think content needs a good mix of both types of content in there. Again, more human interest versus more like educational. But that doesn't mean that like we have SEO content versus non-SEO content. It just means SEO is a major distribution channel for one type and not a major distribution channel for another type.
Yes. And, those human interest stories can work really well with the people that you've already been in contact with. They already know you. They're considering you. They've opted into your newsletter. Maybe you even choose to retarget them with a story like that. Like there's so many ways to get that content in front of people. It doesn't always have to rank. And then also
it's great for interlinking too.
Totally. And it's also great for repurposing. Like once you have those stories, maybe those, a pull quote gets added to a landing page or, there's so many different places you can.
Yes. Yeah. The way we
quotes.
do them is like, we interview a bunch of folks for case studies, and then about 25 to 50% of case study stories could be expanded. And so we'll choose the ones that, we like the most, expand those into the human interest stories, link back to our case studies, which we are trying to get to rank for longer tail, more transactional keywords, right? So our human interest stories can help prop up our case studies in terms of getting those to drive more organic traffic. And then once we have, several human interest stories on a similar topic, we'll wrap them up together, like maybe just like three to five, and turn those into a short white paper. We'll print those white papers and bring them to events with us. They fly off tables. It like gives people stuff to do as they're like listening to like other people talk. We have note sections in there for them. Sales loves the human interest stuff, y'all. They will use it more than they will use any of the pieces that you're like educational pieces. That's like what they're reaching out to folks for or on. And then of course, those human interest stories, you're absolutely right. Super helpful for moving people through the funnel. Super helpful also for retention use. The brands on your platform like to see that other cool brands on your platform are doing cool things on your platform, right?
Yes.
And so it's just this like kind of cycle. So again, we have go-to-market plans that we apply differently to different types of content. So more educational content, more human interest type content, proprietary data reports and research. They have a full marketing go-to-market across all the different channels, right? So it just kind of depends. But always we apply the same principles to every single piece of content. Super high quality, well-researched, copy edited. Like we are making sure that it is our best foot forward every single time because we need to build that thought leadership and brand trust over time. And if we miss for one piece, probably not the end of the world, but like you do that too often or you lower your bar too often and you're really going to be shooting yourself in the foot in terms of trust.
I agree. So I'm going to, after this call, grab a link to one of your human interest stories and add it to the show notes if anybody's interested in checking that out and seeing how you do that over at Klaviyo, because I think that would be really interesting to a lot of the listeners. Something else that you touched on with the content repurposing that I kind of wanted to dive into a little bit more is, content repurposing, isn't just turning your blogs into Twitter threads or LinkedIn posts, although that's usually the kind of content repurposing how-tos that you see floating around on social media. So I just wanted to make that point for listeners. When you're thinking about repurposing, it's not just thinking about how to chop it up. That's distributing the content. That's not the same thing as repurposing, right? Is there anything else that you wanted to add to help people understand the difference there?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I see. Yes, I see a lot of people on social talking about, create once, distribute forever, create once, repurpose forever, all of that jazz. And I agree with those sentiments
Same.
to my
That's good.
core,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yep.
very much agree with that. But then the follow up on that is like, well, you can put it on Reddit and now you put it on Twitter and now on Instagram and now on TikTok. And I'm like, wait, you're missing the most effective part of this, which is thinking through how your organization as a whole can like come together on these pieces of content and use them through all of your inherent go-to-market channels. So you take a company like Klaviyo. Again, we have go-to-markets for each type of piece of content that we put out. For proprietary reports, for instance, which we have one coming out on the 11th. So that's great. So not too far from now. So it's also very top of mind. For proprietary reports, we have our PR team working on it, pitching out to media and seeing if we can't get exclusives. We have our life cycle team working on it in terms, because we have a gated asset as well as a variety of different blogs. So we have automated emails. And then, of course, we have dedicated nurture streams, and we'll be sending dedicated emails out to both customers and prospects. We then also work with our partner ecosystem where for this one that we have coming up, we have about 12 different partners writing blogs that will go live on the same day as our piece goes live, which gets us 12 different backlinks off the bat for this piece. They also will be quoted in our piece, giving advice on a given area. And then we'll be doing a webinar with some of those partners about 2 or 3 weeks later on that same topic. So again, really looking to drive yes, eyeballs, but then those leads. We are then sharing all of that information out with our paid team, who will be putting paid assets behind it, as well as with our sales team, who's going to be reaching out to all of their hot prospects, right? And being like, yo, we just dropped this. It's coming up for this season. It's specific to Black Friday, Cyber Monday, which again is important for our company and organization. Sales teams always want to have something relevant and interesting to give to folks, right? And in general, your entire company, this is why content can be so strategic. Your entire company needs something to say, right?
Right.
Pretty much always. And the people that come up with what to say are you. It's your content team, right? Maybe not only exclusively, you certainly want to work with product marketing and make sure you're aligned there. There's more behind that. But the content team is the one producing the things to say. And it's your job to distribute, yes, to an external audience, but even more so, and maybe more importantly, to an internal audience who already has the eyeballs of your target market.
So you might know I am huge on original research and research reports. And at my last job, we used to do a new report every quarter. We had a sales team. We had a large global partner network. And very similar to what you just said, it's all about enabling your partner network, enabling your employees for that launch day plan. Because if you're not working that into your project management, you're going to not get the same virality that you could potentially get otherwise. And not just virality, but like you said, a report, the ultimate goal is to drive business for the company.
Yes.
So by, using your partners, leveraging their influence and their authority, you're just by default moving that needle faster. And one thing that I have done that might be helpful to anyone listening, with all of my content, what I do in the project management software is I have a template. You just duplicate it and you have every single step in that process within the task so that you can add different steps to different boards if you have your design team on a different board, etc. The only time it doesn't work is for reports, because reports are so big and involve so many steps that I have a completely different board for reports. And that is a whole template in and of itself. So it's worth the lift in my experience. If you're putting out a quality report, that for me is the best thing for repurposing. And you kind of bake that in from the beginning, right? So every finding, every section can just be, broken up. And a lot of times those data points that you're finding can go into that nurture. If you have, you're getting people into your free trial and you're trying to convert them to paid users, sometimes you can have those data points added to the software. or added to the landing page because, the landing page is part of the end-to-end product experience in the kind of freemium product. I view it that way. There's just so many great uses for reports. So yeah, I'm on the same page there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, over at BigCommerce as well, I was over there for 4.5 years, and it was after 2 years there that we launched our first proprietary report. And that was when we started seeing the beginnings of our SEO growth. I mean, it kicked things off for us really well. And at that point, we started doing them about at least twice a year, sometimes once a quarter, just kind of depending. But it was a huge learning for us back then where it was like, oh, when you can produce something, I mean, it was a ton of work. I mean, reports are certainly a lot of upfront work, but God, when you do them right, and it takes time, right? You can build the muscle and get better at them over time. But that was when we really started seeing some of our biggest wins. And then those pieces, because they were doing so well from an organic perspective, would lift the rest of the website and the rest of the content as well. So, I mean, you want to talk about being a thought leader, proprietary reports, I wouldn't say are a shortcut there, but doing them well and doing them frequently can get you there faster than maybe just publishing regular blogs.
Yeah, 100%, because it's different than the regular educational blog where you're just relying on best practices. You're able to add something net new to the conversation, which helps a lot.
So much.
Yeah, so much. So I know we're running up on time. I have one final thing that I wanted to talk about. So as I said, I read your newsletter pretty religiously, and in issue 5, which I will share in the show notes, you shared your template for kind of career pathing for content marketers. And I love this. I spent about 7+ years managing content teams, and I wish I would have had something like this when I started, because I created everything myself. How am I going to career path these people? How am I going to develop them? And this is so great. And I hope people will look at this and steal this. But, on the one end of your rubric that you can use with your teams, you can sit down and kind of align with them, because it's really important for employees to know where they stand, right? So you can get aligned and you can ask them, what do you aspire to do? If you want to be a content marketer or a specialist or a strategist and you want to be the best you can in that role, let's help you be the best you can. If you're aspiring to move up and you want to be a director of content or a VP of content, what does that look like? What are the concrete things that you need to be doing? So I love the rubric. I love a rubric in general. Something I thought was interesting is on the one side, you have, really what I consider to be basic things that you need to have as a content marketer. So those would be, let's see, ideate content, write compelling content. That is table stakes, right? But as you kind of move along in your evolution, you need to develop the ability to collaborate effectively cross-functionally across the org. And, a lot of content specialists don't necessarily understand what that means. So I'd love to hear kind of what you think would be effective working across the org and outside of your sphere of influence on the marketing team.
Yeah.
And then I'd also love to hear about something else that's really, really important, especially if you are creating this kind of content that's going to drive thought leadership. You need to be able to strategically connect the various business threads. And that's important. And not everybody is going to pop out of college and just know how to do that, right? So how do you think about those two things, and how do you help your employees develop in those two areas, collaboration and making strategic connections?
Yes, it's a really good question. So one, I want to start here, which is the number one complaint I hear through my newsletter from content marketers that I know in general it's been my number one complaint historically everywhere, is that they don't have enough resources to do all of the things asked of them. And to me, the further I get in my career, I'm oh man, I don't know what I used to think it was, but I'm that's a lack of strategic communication. You aren't communicating well enough with your leaders and setting those expectations about what content can do, how you can do it, how much you can do it, given that budget, and communicating in the language of those leaders. So that's why I have in that rubric the beginning of cross team collaboration as well as strategic communication, starting pretty early for folks, because even if you don't aspire to become a director or like a leader in content marketing, your life as a content marketer is going to be far easier if you know how to communicate well with your execs. The biggest difference to me in terms of someone who's junior in content and more senior is your ability to distribute and effectively communicate your content to your leadership versus your prospects. Prospects is a given, right? Like that's the job, but being able to help your leadership understand what content can do for an organization can fundamentally change your career, changes the work you do, gets you more resources over time. I mean, so much stuff. That is the ultimate solve to that problem, but it takes time. So in terms of building good cross-team collaboration or like cross-org collaboration, one is, you have to go talk to people. You need to be decently friendly. And then, of course, you need to understand how those orgs work and like what those people need to succeed at their job. So I used to have this when I was at Big Commerce. I haven't brought it with me, but I should, honestly. I should go back and find it, which was like the top questions to ask folks when you like first meet them. And one of the questions was like, what's the hardest part of your job? Right. And that is really just for a content person trying to understand like what keeps this person up at night. Right. Like, and you probably as a content person can't help all the time, but you can either sympathize as a human being, which helps to build that trust. And when people trust you, they're going to like working with you a whole lot more, or be more willing to work with you a whole lot more. Or maybe content can solve those things. Now, building these relationships takes time. I started at Klaviyo 7 months ago and began laying the foundations for building really good relationships with a variety of different orgs. That's like just now really starting to come to fruition. We still have a ways to go as we do more, larger go-to-market programs with content and, learn what it is that people need to use our content in their channels, kind of properly set rules and boundaries like, hey, maybe in the future, you can't like drop out of this 2 weeks before it goes live when you said before that like you want it, right? And so like it's one, treating people like you want to be treated, of course, always being nice, figuring out what drives them. Philosophy can be stupid helpful here. There's a free online course on YouTube called Justice 101 that I rewatch or re-listen to every year. It's a Harvard course. It is so good. It doesn't talk about it in terms of like how to like use it to understand people, but you will like inherently learn that through this course. That's super helpful. And then of course, the thing that I always tell, saying you did a phenomenal job earlier where it's like, yes, and always saying yes, and as often as possible. People like tighten up when you say like, oh, but, or those kind of things. So like you were able to get people to agree more often. It's a yes, and even if your and is completely opposite what they said before, totally fine. It still keeps people open. And then the final piece of it is, I have very clear content philosophies in terms of like where we do and do not, or I guess very clear content philosophies, and I don't like to compromise on them, right? I've seen content work in these ways. I know we're trying to build that leadership over time. I want 3 customers included in each piece of content. I want at least 3 examples, so on and so forth. But there are times when another organization is going to ask your team to publish something on the blog that probably doesn't hit all of those things. And you have to make a strategic decision then on if you do it. Now, most of the time, maybe you'll say no. But for me, I'm always trying to think through, okay, how well have I built this relationship with this org on a personal level already? And what could doing this for them now help? How might that help to build that relationship? So ultimately, the advice I give my team is like, look, we don't want to compromise on the things that we know to be inherently true about content unless we're compromising to plant seeds. And that's different. That is a completely different way of looking at working with folks internally. Again, I started this, I guess, maybe more than 7 months. I don't know, back in January at Klaviyo, and I'm just now beginning to reap the fruit of those seeds that I began planting back then. This stuff takes time because it takes time to build trust with people in general, always. So that's on that one. And then in terms of learning, like how each of the individual channels work, this is really challenging for a lot of content folks, especially if you are stuck as a service organization.
And by service organization, I'm reading into that as a ticket taking function where people tell you what to do and you do it.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that was clear for whoever's listening.
Like a lot of creative organizations are service organizations, right? Like someone needs an asset, they get a brief to you, you create the asset, right? Content can often serve in that function as well, though a lot of times it kind of blends. A lot of marketing distribution channels, and a lot of people think of content as a distribution channel. I don't like it. It is like where the thing starts and then you distribute it.
Right, exactly.
But a lot of folks internally do think of content as just another channel that they can try to get something out on. If you're stuck in that service org or with internal folks thinking of you as a distribution channel, it could be hard to learn how all of the other channels ultimately function. Meeting people and asking that question about what's the hardest part of their job is a really good way to begin to understand it. Essentially, you were trying to move from being a specialist to a generalist and understanding how marketing works across the board. And you don't have to start with all the channels. Like start with, if you're more interested in social, like I hate social, but like if you're more interested in social, like start there. Like how do things get distributed there? What works best there? How can you then learn and understand about what works best for social and apply that into the content that you're creating so that when you repurpose it or when it's reformatted for those channels, it's way easier and you're helping them hit success far faster. It's going to make that organization trust you more. It's going to make that organization rely on you more. Now you're beginning to move out of a service org into an organization that can provide more strategy for people. Once you're done with social, maybe you go to the email marketing team or lifecycle team. Same thing. What's the hardest part of their job? Where are people getting stuck in the funnel? What do you wish you had? How might like my org be able to help? And then actively start figuring out both how you can produce that content for them, but how you can think about how you can add elements to the content you're already producing to make sure that when it's repurposed for those channels, they already have what they need. So you're mostly trying to figure out, one, what it is those orgs need so you can begin to understand those channels better. And then two, making it easier for everyone else to do their jobs. And the more you do that, the quicker you move from service org into strategy org, because the better you're understanding what everyone ultimately needs. And most people I've worked with, at least on the content side, like being in a strategy org better because that's where you can control yourself not burning out, for instance.
Yes. And, you know, I did an employee engagement report a few years back, and it clearly showed that the more an employee feels like the work they're doing is connected to the business strategy, the more engaged they are with their work. And when you're actually a strategic org, you can actually understand and see and drive those results. And that's very engaging for employees at all different levels. So I think that's really important. Just wanted to add one thing. A personal learning for me is when I first, didn't understand all these different pieces, I kind of sat and tried to just absorb and go research. And that was a big mistake. I think the best thing you can do if you're in a meeting and someone says something and it's something you don't understand, if it's an acronym, or just raise your hand and be like, oh, what do you mean? That's okay. It's okay to be vulnerable and to ask for what you need in the moment, because otherwise you sit there and you've wasted 30 minutes of your time in the meeting not knowing what the hell is going on. It's better to raise your hand. Now you know, now you can process the information. You're not wasting your time, right?
Yep. And you can also go out I know a bunch of people do this already, which is like go get like digital coffees with people, all of that jazz. Folks usually do that within their own channel, right? So
Yeah.
content folks do it with content folks. Go find the people you think are doing social really great, or find someone who is an email marketer and hop on a call with them and figure out, one, how does content work with your organization at your company? How do you wish they did it? How might you advise folks do it, right?
Mhm.
You can learn a lot from other practitioners in the industry, because like within marketing, ideally, we're all working in an integrated fashion, which means we're all reusing each other's stuff. Now, that isn't how it always works at a lot of organizations, but that is the ultimate goal. And you can be the like person who brings that goal to life at your organization. But yeah, it is hard early learning, because there's so many nuances to all of
Yeah.
these different channels that, again, unless you're in the arena, you don't necessarily know about or are easy to miss.
And be proactive. I have now worked with so many different content marketers from working with all different clients. And
Yep.
for me, what sets people apart is being proactive, going to get the information you need, not passively waiting until someone gives it to you or someone kind of spoon feeds you. So I would
Yep.
say if you want to rise in your career, work on yourself to become more proactive, to go out and make these things happen rather than waiting for people to give you the information.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
curiosity.
Yeah, for
Great.
sure. Cool. So Tracey, is there anything else you wanted to add before I ask you to tell people where they can find you?
I mean, the like thing that's super top of mind for me, I guess, right now, because of inflation and potential recession, and I know a lot of orgs are laying people off. You always want to, in your content career, do what you can, where you can, to track content down to leads, down to MQLs, down to revenue. The more you can do that, the safer your job is at all of these organizations. Content drives revenue basically anywhere that it is at, but it is often seen as a function that just drives sessions top of funnel, and that's wrong. Do what you can to try to turn more sessions into leads, more of those leads into MQLs, and tracking those MQLs down to revenue where you can, and be proactive about reporting those numbers out to your leadership and using those as KPIs to grow the organization. Because ultimately, and this is something all of us just have to recognize, that like we live and work in a capitalist world, and that means that like the money your business makes is ultimately what is most important. And any organization at the company that can prove their impact to the bottom line is far safer than those that are struggling to do that.
100%. Be proactive, be collaborative, go make friends with the folks in your RevOps function.
Yeah.
Make sure that you're asking for the data that you want to see, because you might not know how to go in and pull all that data. So that's why you need to really be making those relationships, right? And going after what you need. All right, Tracey, thanks so much. Where
Thank
can folks
you.
find you? Of course, I will have all the links in the show notes on my website, but if they're listening, where can they find you and connect with you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on Twitter pretty often, so it's just at Trace Wall. You can find me on LinkedIn too. It's Tracey with an EY, Tracey Wallace over there, though I'm not on LinkedIn as often as I am on Twitter. So if you want to get in touch, Twitter's probably the best spot. And then, of course, I have a newsletter. It's called Contentment, over with the good folks at Workweek. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Tracey, this has been really great. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. It's honestly such a good way to start my day. I really appreciated it.
I'm glad. All right. Thank you
so much.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Notorious Thought Leader. If you're looking for more stories from marketers who are generating demand from thought leadership, then visit us at motionagency.io/notorious. See you next time.